It was June 1st, 1983, a warm Wednesday in Louisville, Kentucky, and Ann Gotlib stood looking out the front door of her apartment in the West Bushel neighborhood, eagerly waiting for her 12-year-old daughter Ann to come pedaling around the corner. Ann should have been home a while ago. Ludmilla called Ann's friend Tanya, who said they had biked to the mall across the street about 30 minutes earlier, and Ann had headed home from there. Ludmilla's husband, Anatoly, was on a business trip to Michigan, so she was left to her own devices. She was on her own to worry. Ludmilla told herself not to be concerned, but just in case, she immediately walked to the mall to look for Ann. When she arrived, all she found was Ann's red bicycle leaning against a wall outside the Bacon's department store. A parent's worst nightmare started to unfold. Ann would never have left her bike against the wall. She always laid it on the ground because the kickstand was broken. Frantic, she looked around, using her intermediate English skills to ask passersby if they had seen her little red-haired, freckle-faced daughter. Where was Ann? There was no trace of her. She had vanished, gone, and Ann would never be seen again, and her disappearance would become one of Louisville's greatest mysteries. Welcome to Kentucky Case Files, the Ann Gotlib case, Part 1, Little Girl Vanished. I'm Marcus Roland.
And I'm Emily Steele. Today, in the final case of Kentucky Case Files' inaugural season, we begin a three-part series that will shake any parent to the core. It's a story that left a family devastated and a community shaken, had investigators searching for answers for decades, and contributed to long-term changes in how we investigate missing kids.
June 1st, 1983, a 12-year-old little girl vanishes from Bashford Manor Mall. The bicycle she used to get there, the only clue left behind.
If you recognize this man, or if you saw something yesterday involving this girl at the Bashford Manor Mall, call the police.
It would be a terrible tragedy for any family, but for us, it was double or triple because our goal to immigrate was to create the brighter future for our child.
Who was Ann Gotlib? Ann was born in Kyiv, in what was then the Soviet Union and is now the capital of independent Ukraine. In 1980, when she was just 9 years old, her parents, Anatoly and Ludmilla, made the decision to emigrate. Like many Jewish families at the time, they were seeking freedom, opportunity, and safety. Louisville, Kentucky became their new home, and Ann adapted quickly. She learned English fluently, though she still spoke Russian with her parents. Friends and neighbors described her as bright, artistic, and full of energy. She skipped a grade in elementary school, and her sixth-grade teacher at Jewish day school called her a serious thinker. They remembered her as shy but warm, a girl with a quick smile who was adjusting well to American life. She loved to draw and dreamed of becoming a doctor.
The Gotlibs lived in the Royal Arms apartment complex on Gerald Court, just off Bardstown Road, which was directly across the street from the Bashford Manor Mall. At the time she went missing, Ann was about 5'1", weighed 85 pounds, and besides her red hair and freckles, she had hazel eyes. Ludmilla was a homemaker and preschool teacher. Anatoly was an engineer. They were members of the Jewish Community Center and the Temple, Kentucky's oldest and largest Jewish synagogue. They were an immigrant family making their way in their new home. Now, let's talk about what life was like in 1983. And Emily, I'm sure you remember what it was like growing up around that time. We didn't have cell phones, Ring doorbell cameras, or even many security cameras, and the internet did not exist. Social media wasn't dreamed about, and the 24-hour news cycle was far into the future. And it was also the height of the Cold War, and tensions were sky high between the United States and the Soviet Union. And as American kids, we were taught to fear Russia, and I remember that. It felt like we were always on the verge of someone pressing the button. When it came to being kids, we went outside in the summer and stayed out pretty much all day until we came home for supper. No one thought anything of letting kids roam around untethered and unsupervised. Contrary to today, when information and people are at our fingertips, then we as people were more comfortable with not knowing things. I don't want to romanticize it because clearly there was evil in the world, but there was a sense of societal safety for the most part.
So you know what's funny? And maybe this is, Mark, because I grew up as an only child, but you grew up as an only child too. Is it because I grew up as
Yeah.
a only girl child? So
Yeah.
by 83, I remember vividly, we were living in a suburb of Eugene, Oregon. And I definitely spent my summers roaming around the neighborhood with the neighborhood kids. But there had been in the news a couple of kind of high profile kidnappings, both of children, but also of like I remember running's really big in Eugene, University of Oregon, Nike, all these things. And I remember a story of a woman going jogging and being abducted. And it was definitely something, the level of supervision was exactly as you describe it, like virtually non-existent. But already, I remember getting messaging from my parents about this kind of growing unease around possibilities of young girls and women disappearing, essentially.
Yeah. It is quite the contrast. I can remember basically running out, playing in the yard, going up to the neighbor's house, maybe telling my parents where I was. No big deal at all. And of course, we lived in a more of a rural area, but so there wasn't a lot of, I guess, opportunity to run into strangers, really.
Right.
We lived in a
Right.
rural area, and the people you knew were the people you knew that you lived next to.
Whereas we had the Grateful Dead concerts and like drifters passing through out west was like a very common. I can remember us picking up hitchhikers a couple of times in the 80s, which you just think no one would do that now. But yeah.
Oh, no. Yeah, we did it in college. We would pick up people. Yeah.
Just different times, just really different times.
Yeah.
But for the Gottlieb family, that sense of safety evaporated on June 1st, 1983, when Anatoly and Ludmila's world came crashing down. And the missing children panic, which we'll talk about later, arrived in Kentucky. Earlier that day, Anne had taken a bus to the Jewish Community Center where she met her friend Rachel Podgorski. Later, Rachel's mother dropped Anne off at her family's apartment, and Anne biked to the home of another friend, Tanya Okmansky, whose family, like Anne's, were Russian Jews. They watched television until Ludmila called and told Anne to come home. Tanya rode bikes with Anne part of the way, then waved goodbye when they neared the mall. What happened in the next hour or so is still mostly a mystery. When Ludmila reported Anne missing, the search began immediately. What was then the Jefferson County Police Department coordinated with the FBI. A report in the Louisville Courier-Journal 2 days after the disappearance said the investigation called forth an impressive commitment of police resources. Helicopters searched from the air, and hundreds of volunteers scoured parks, neighborhoods, and wooded areas in eastern Jefferson County. Here is the piece that bothers me about the case, which is the mom calls when she's at her friend Tanya's and tells her it's time to come home. And yet she makes a detour to the mall. There's no sign that she tried to go straight home and was dragged to the mall. Her bike's there. There's no evidence that she struggled with anyone on her bike.
I think Tanya had said that when she called Tanya said they had parted ways at the mall. And I think that's why she went back there.
But so parted ways, but my understanding is that they had ridden their bikes that far.
Right.
Because mom had said it's time to come home. So Tanya's like riding with her part of the way and then presumably
Right.
head home from there.
Uh-huh.
But instead she detours to the mall. I find that curious. What was she going there for? Well, I mean, and I don't know why. Did anyone ask that? Did anyone wonder about that? Was there something she wanted to look for at the mall? Did she want to meet somebody there? Why not just keep riding her bike straight on home when she parted ways with Tanya?
Because like you said, there was no evidence of a struggle or...
Right. There was no evidence that she was derailed from getting home.
Yeah.
Like ended up at the mall. Though I guess it's possible. It's possible someone could have pulled her off, but it seems unlikely that would have gone unnoticed somehow.
There are a lot of gaps
That
there.
moment, yeah, that period of time between her leaving Tanya's presence and then her bike being found at the mall is just so curious to me.
Yeah.
What happened there? A familiar name today, Mitch McConnell, who was then the Jefferson County Judge Executive, announced a reward for credible information about Ann's disappearance. Flyers went up across the city. Ann's photo made hers one of the most recognizable faces in Kentucky and eventually the nation.
Police were initially confident that the area near the mall and the Royal Arms apartments would provide clues because two teenage girls reported that they thought they witnessed an abduction of a girl around Ann's age in the marshy area surrounding the complex. The girls reported seeing an older man in a white fishing cap leading a teenage girl away from the area. The girls had initially dismissed the scene as a parent leading away an unruly child. But later, when the missing persons report went out, they contacted police.
This sighting, plus an eerily timed incident early in the day, gave police their first lead. A man had reportedly sexually abused a different child at the Jewish Community Center earlier in the day and exposed himself to 3 other individuals near the Bashford Manor Mall area, 2 locations directly connected to Ann. Once police released a photo of Ann and a composite sketch of the suspect, calls flooded in. But it was a deluge of dead ends.
3 days after Ann's disappearance, a police bloodhound picked up her scent close to a drainage ditch adjacent to an apartment complex just across from the mall. The dog led them to the home of Esther Okmiansky, the grandmother of Ann's friend Tanya, the last person to see Ann alive. But Okmiansky said Ann had never been to her apartment. Curiously, FBI agents dismissed the lead and said the dog, which had been trained to track humans, must have made a mistake and was drawn to the window by the smell of food cooking. The Okmiansky family was cleared by the FBI. Although they were appreciative of the police's work on the case, Ann's parents harbored a bit of frustration for how the FBI approached the Okmianskys. As they told the Courier-Journal, "We always got the impression that they were protective of the Okmianskys," Ludmilla said. "We were told that the FBI didn't want to violate their civil rights." I find this very peculiar. I think
It feels like very plausible that that whatever happened to her could have involved someone she already knew. And the fact that the FBI wouldn't be attuned to that. Though, here's the thing I don't know that I would be curious about is I don't know what kinds of cultural differences the FBI might have been sensitive to coming into an immigrant community.
sure.
FBI agents themselves didn't have a real cultural link to these individuals. They might have felt out of their depth and not wanting to overly meddle inside a community. But I do wonder at that time, it would have to be that they were perceived as culturally quite different. And I don't know if that was the case or not. But that does seem plausible to me, that if they felt like they didn't want to intrude on it might have compromised their judgment around pursuing that lead.
Yeah, it just strikes me as very peculiar that a specific piece of evidence, the dog picking up the scent, would be just so easily
And
dismissed.
leading them to somewhere where there's an obvious connection.
Relationship to, connection, yeah.
The missing child, that seems strange to not follow up on that more. As days turned into weeks, hope began to fade. Even the prime suspect seemed to have an alibi. Ralph Barry Barber had a history of public indecency and even admitted to exposing himself at the Jewish Community Center on June 1st, 1983. He also admitted to other incidents of sexual abuse and molestation in the area. However, at the time of Ann's abduction, Barber had an alibi definitively placing him in Lexington, Kentucky, dropping off an order at a trophy shop. Workers at the store confirmed his story. As the Courier-Journal reported, this would be the first of 1,000 dead ends. Police pursued avenues from infrared satellite photography to psychics and even featured Ann on billboards, one of the first such uses for a missing child. She was one of the first missing kids to be featured on a milk carton, such a vivid recollection from the culture of the 80s. Ann was also featured on national TV. Nothing came of the efforts. Theories for her disappearance began to mount. Had Ann been forced into a prostitution ring and was ashamed to return to her family? Had she been brainwashed? Had she been forced into a cult and held in a house on Blue Lick Road in Louisville, as one police tipster claimed? There was no such house.
Given the mood of the nation in 1983, one of the most interesting ideas was the KGB theory. As the Courier-Journal reported, Ann's father, Anatoly, was a trained mining engineer who had worked with exploration teams to find and exploit new energy sources and investigated energy needs for economic development forecasts. While in the United States, he worked for Bechtel Petroleum, a subsidiary of the Bechtel Group, which was a giant construction and engineering company with alleged links to the CIA. That, plus the FBI's immediate involvement in the case, prompted speculation that the Soviet Union might have been behind Ann's disappearance, kidnapping her to force the Gotlibs to return to the country. Anatoly and Ludmila dismissed this theory, saying that they weren't important enough to trigger such interest. Anatoly was not privy to sensitive or classified information, and the FBI found no evidence to support such a theory. Some investigators thought Ann had simply run away. A woman told police she had seen Ann crying at the Jewish community center and that Ann had told her she had trouble making and keeping friends. A teacher told police Ann was upset because she had thrown a birthday party and no one came. There was even talk that a couple of weeks before the disappearance, Ann's mother talked of taking her to see a psychologist. But the runaway theory was weak, given Ann never contacted a friend or relative, had never run away before, and took no money or possessions with her. Ann's parents dismissed the idea, saying Ann couldn't even conceive of the idea of running away, and that she had also been looking forward to an upcoming family vacation.
Ann had also written a short story about a girl named Karen who was forced to move with her family. Equally curious, she had been reading a novel about a 6-year-old boy who goes missing. In the book, the boy's mother realized he was missing when she found his bicycle leaning against a wall. But investigators dismissed a lot of what Ann was experiencing as general preteen anxiety, not evidence of any intent to run away. 10 years after the event, while revisiting the case, police determined the runaway theory is even more unlikely because it was improbable a young girl could run away and stay hidden for so many years.
Amid the vacuum of credible information and swirling theories, police turned their investigation to the nearly 200 tips they had received in the weeks following the abduction. One caller thought that Ann had been killed and was buried at Long Run Cemetery. There was a fresh mound of dirt there, the caller said, but it was merely a groundhog clearing its den. A professor at Jefferson Community College reported one of his students had written an essay about the stalking and torturing of a red-headed female. Police located the student, who lived next to one of Ann's friends, but he told them that he had wanted to write something dramatic to impress the professor. He passed a polygraph test. There was also a ransom demand, but the caller never followed up. An Egyptian immigrant reported that her estranged husband had buried something small behind their home near Simpsonville. Police discovered only a dead dog there. Finally, in January 1984, 7 months after Ann's disappearance, there seemed to be a break in the case. Another strong suspect came to light.
Police had arrested a man on charges of breaking and entering, assault with a deadly weapon, and attempted rape of a 13-year-old girl. The man was, remember this name, Gregory Lewis Oakley Jr., a 41-year-old former veterinarian who had lost his license to practice in Alabama following a conviction of assaulting 2 minor girls and injecting them with narcotics. He had come to Louisville in 1982 when he was hired as a meat and poultry inspector for the U.S. Department of Agriculture office in Jefferson County, which said it was unaware of his criminal background. The circumstantial evidence against Oakley seemed solid. As a veterinarian, he had access to drugs. As a federal official, he carried a badge and the authority it conveyed. And grimly, as a USDA inspector, he had access to slaughterhouses where a body could be disposed of. In addition, investigators obtained bank records revealing that a couple of hours before Ann's disappearance, Oakley was at a Liberty National Bank branch near Bashford Manor Mall. A polygraph showed Oakley lied when he denied any involvement in Ann's disappearance. Despite the evidence, Oakley insisted he had left town after withdrawing the money, and there was no physical evidence linking him to Ann. So he was cleared.
That's another one that I just find is incredible. I'm obviously not in law enforcement, not an investigator, don't know what the procedures and protocols are, but when you just listen to this as a layperson, it sounds like, what were they thinking or not thinking?
And so here's what I can't remember, because I don't have a good enough sense. When did forensic evidence involving DNA really become commonly used? I wonder when we say there's no physical evidence linking him to Ann, what would they have been evaluating at that moment in the 90s? What are we were 7 months. So we're at the start of 84.
Yeah.
Would they have looked for samples of anything in his car? Or obviously clothes is a stretch, but it does feel like, at least if he had a vehicle, that would they have been able to sweep it for things? I just don't know. I guess it's limited at that point what they could.
I think so. I think it was very limited. My first real recollection of DNA being used in a legal context to exonerate someone, basically, was the O.J. Simpson case, because that was very important in that case. And that was like early 90s.
95. That's 95.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, we're a whole decade away from that. And here's the other thing is, given this individual's background, he may have been, and repeat history, he may have been fairly careful about cleaning up after himself, and he may have had those capabilities. But yeah, this feels, again, I wonder, were they just overwhelmed? It seems like constantly there are so many possibilities that aren't working out, but then they also seem to be just letting go of things that do feel like there might be some significance there.
And maybe they just were so inundated with theories and reports and calls that it was just overwhelming. I haven't a clue. Yeah.
Interesting. Then in May of 1984, Ann's picture was featured during a made-for-TV movie about a missing child. A viewer from Boston's Charlestown section reported seeing a scared, freckle-faced girl. The girl ran away when she was called by name. Detectives swarmed the area, but turned up nothing.
And years passed. Another suspect cropped up in 1987 in a case involving an abduction of a 10-year-old freckle-faced girl in Jefferson County. As with Ann, the girl's mother went looking for her when she did not return home and found her abandoned bicycle near a convenience store. The girl was eventually found alive in a barn in eastern Jefferson County. The abductor was a 51-year-old Kenneth Gene Hensley. Hensley denied involvement in Ann's disappearance, and police believed him, noting that they considered him too dim-witted to have traveled as far as the Bashford Manor Mall.
Then in 1990, there was a confession. Michael Lee Lockhart was a 29-year-old Texas inmate serving 3 death sentences, 2 for killing girls in Indiana and Florida. He told the FBI he had murdered 20 to 30 girls and that one of them was Ann Gotlib. He claimed he'd buried her at nearby Fort Knox, where he was stationed in 1983. For 3 days, a team of 120 investigators and volunteers dug up a remote tank range. Lockhart could not pinpoint the exact burial site, and eventually detectives determined he had been toying with them. He was eventually shipped back to Texas and returned to death row. He was executed in 1997.
Through it all, Anatoly and Ludmila Gotlib never stopped searching. They appeared on TV, spoke to reporters, and begged the public for help. They were immigrants, far from extended family, and navigating not only grief, but also the barriers of language and culture. In a hopeful note, the Louisville community rallied around them. But as the years passed, the lead slowed. The case grew cold. No body was ever found. And Ann's parents were left with an unthinkable void, their child gone and no answers.
Then, in 2008, police finally named a solid suspect, citing new evidence. Remember Gregory Lewis Oakley, the disgraced former veterinarian? Police concluded it had been him all along, but in a twist of fate, he could no longer face justice because he died in 2002. Investigators said the evidence against him was so strong that if he were still alive, he'd already be in custody.
Here's Louisville Detective Barry Wilkerson.
I think I had every bit of probable cause to make that arrest if he were alive. I think I could put together a perfect package with the Commonwealth Attorney.
And that goes back to what you were saying. What new evidence? And what could the new evidence have been? Would it have been something as sophisticated as DNA?
Because fast forward, because this is the thing I find fascinating about DNA evidence, right? Is you get these projects going through evidence that's decades old and testing it and finding DNA matches or finding a lack of a DNA. It sticks around. And so it is interesting to think that a case in the early 80s, that some progress could be made on it decades later simply because of these advances in technology. But Mark, what did they come up with circa 2008?
Detectives think Oakley abducted Ann from Bashford Manor Mall on June 1st and killed her with an injection of the painkiller Talwin, a drug he would have had access to as a veterinarian. Authorities never said what they think he did with Ann's body. The break came soon after the case's 25th anniversary. Oakley's former girlfriend confirmed to police he'd been in Louisville on June 1st and that he had asked her to wash his clothes that night, despite his claims of leaving town. A one-time cellmate also came forward saying Oakley had confessed to kidnapping and killing Ann, a story that held up on a polygraph test. Oakley's past matched the pattern. He'd been convicted twice in Alabama for abducting teenage girls and injecting them with drugs, and he later served prison time in Kentucky for attacking a 13-year-old girl in Louisville in 1984. In 2001, Oakley wrote the Courier-Journal proclaiming his innocence. "I have never seen Ann Gotlib in my life," he said. He also said that he had no reason to lie because he was suffering from terminal lung cancer. He would die a year later. And when he died, any chance for a trial died with him, leaving the Gotlib family without the closure they had waited decades to find.
Bobby Jones, the detective who arrested Oakley for the 1984 abduction, for which he was sent to prison, apologized to the Gotlib family, saying he wished he had worked harder to link Oakley and Ann's disappearance. "I'd just like to apologize to them for not being more aggressive," Jones said. He eventually added that he didn't think the case was handled properly. He said, "I believe we could have solved it back in 1984. What makes him say that? Like, we have our guesses about maybe they were overwhelmed, maybe they felt like they were working with outsiders, or they felt like outsiders in a specific community. Maybe they just didn't have access to the same kind of technology. But what? I wonder."
There was a lot of discussion, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later, about, I guess for lack of a better word, there was a lot of sloppiness in how the cases and the case files were managed. They were in different places.
And
There were a lot of... Go ahead. Yeah.
No, so this is interesting because early on the FBI were involved, but was it always more local police work that dealt with Oakley?
Yes, it appeared to have been that. Yeah.
Maybe Louisville wasn't used to having a lot of these kinds of cases to deal with. Maybe didn't have a lot of experience. Maybe not necessarily a lot of officers with the kind of experience in managing this kind of a case.
Yeah.
But there would be no trial for Oakley because prosecutors did not wish to bring a posthumous indictment. So was the case really solved?
For years, the disappearance of Ann Gotlib haunted Louisville. Her face and the photo of her red bicycle propped against a pillar at the mall were everywhere. on billboards, milk cartons, posters stapled to telephone poles, in Louisville media. A reminder of Louisville and Kentucky in the age of the missing children panic.
In the next episode, How We Find Missing Kids, Then and Now, we'll look at the data behind child abductions and stranger danger and explore how investigators in the 1980s worked missing children's cases and how those methods have evolved. We'll look at what's changed, what hasn't, and how cases like Ann Gotlib's reshaped the way law enforcement responds when a child disappears.
Sourcing for this podcast came from our own reporting, the Courier-Journal, the Lexington Herald-Leader, WHAS News, Wave 3 News, CBS, National Crime Information Center, the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, the Exploited Children's Help Organization ECHO, the Center on Juvenile and Criminal Justice, letgrow.org, childfindofamerica.org, doenetwork.org, and missingkids.org.